Zeches Moed Katan Daf Chaf. We begin several lines into the daf as we have already discussed the first few lines as the conclusion of the last sugya of the previous daf. We're going to have four primary sugyas in halacha in this daf, all in halachas avelos. The first one is when a Yom Tov arrives in the middle of Shiva, does it cancel it only if the Shiva is at least 3 days old or even if it's just a moment old? Second question will be, what is the source of the halacha of Shiva, that we know that it's 7 days long? The third halachic issue is what happens when somebody hears about the avelos that he's supposed to be keeping late. It's at least 30 days after the death of his relative. And the fourth halachic discussion is which relatives should a person sit Shiva and Shloshim for. So let's begin. We have a brisa that says, what is the halacha when Yom Tov arrives in the middle of a person's Shiva, that it cancels the Shiva? So we have a machlokes Tanaim. According to Rabbi Eliezer and Beis Shammai, it only cancels Shiva if the Shiva is at least 3 days old. Otherwise, the Shiva has to continue after Yom Tov. According to Chachamim, in Beis Hillel, the Gemara says, even if the Shiva is just 1 minute old, it will cancel the Shiva already. It does not have to complete the Shiva after Yom Tov has ended. Now, what is the halacha? So the Gemara brings a list of Amoraim who hold like Beis Hillel and the Chachamim that it's 1 minute old. The Gemara says that you have Rav Huna named Rav Chiya bar Abba named Rav Yochanan, and some say that it's Rav Yochanan to Rav Chiya bar Abba the name of Rav Huna. But this is the halacha. Now Rava disagrees. Rava says, like our Mishnah, that it's got to be 3 days old. Now the Gemara has a few incidents here. The Gemara says that Ravina went to Surah on the Paras River, and he said to Rav Chaviva, and Rav Chaviva said to Ravina, what is the halacha? And he said that it's even if the avelos is only 1 day old, it cancels. Even if it's only 1 hour old, it is canceled by the Yom Tov that arrives. Now, the Gemara says that Rav Chiya bar Abba was sitting together with Rav Ami and Rav Yitzchak Nafcha on the porch of Rav Yitzchak ben Elazar, and they discussed the following thing. What is the source of the halacha that avelos morning is a 7-day period of sitting, what we call Shiva? How do we know that it's for 7 days? So the Gemara says, because the Torah says, V'hafachti chagechem le'eva, I'll turn your Yom Tov into mourning. It's part of a curse. So if your Yom Tov, which is 7 days long, will turn into mourning, so you see that mourning is also supposed to be 7 days long. The Gemara says, well, how do you know this is referring to a 7-day Yom Tov? Maybe it's referring to Shavuos, which is only 1 day. So now the Gemara introduces, as an answer to this, the topic of Shmua Rechoka. Shmua Rechoka means where you did not hear about an avelos, you did not hear about the death of a relative until a long time after it occurred. So the Gemara says, yes, there is such a thing as an avelos, which is 1 day, and that's learned from Shavuos, from this pasuk and from Shavuos, and that's if you didn't hear about it until a long time after it occurred. So therefore you have both. The regular standard avelos is learned out from the pasuk that says, I'll turn your Yom Tov into an avelos, and that's a 7-day Yom Tov, and therefore a 7-day avelos, but you could also have one like Shavuos, and that's where you didn't hear about it until a long time afterwards. Now the Gemara goes deeply into the halachos of what happens when you have a Shmua Rechoka. We don't hear about it until much later. The Gemara says it is actually a 3-way machlokes what halacha is if you don't hear about it until much later. So first of all, let's talk about the 4 areas of halacha we're going to be discussing in Shmua Rechoka. Number 1 is, what is the definition of a Shmua Rechoka? Number 2 is, what is the halacha when one hears about the loss of a relative after a long time in a Shmua Rechoka? Number 3 is, what happens if the Shmua Rechoka is extended by a Yom Tov or by a Shabbos? And the 4th is, do we tear Kriya when a Shmua Rechoka has occurred? So first of all, what is the definition of a Shmua Rechoka? The Gemara quotes Rabbi Kiva and Brisa says Shmua Rechoka is 30 days. If somebody didn't hear about the loss of his relative until 30 days after the death, that's called Shmua Rechoka. What is the halacha? 3 opinions. Rabbi Akiva says he only has to keep 1 day of avelos, 1 day of Shiva, and the Gemara is going to note later that we do say a miktzah yom kakula, so he only has to keep a part of the day. Does not have to keep Shloshim at all. The Chachamim say he has to keep regular Shiva and Shloshim. There's no difference, there's no significance to the fact that he didn't hear about it until much later. Now the Gemara is going to quote a brisa later that says it depends what the loss is. If it's the loss of a mother or a father, and as a parent, then he does have to keep regular Shiva and Shloshim, and if it's any of the other 7 relatives, that means the 5 other relatives, 5 of the 7 besides the mother and the father, then he does not have to keep a full 7 or 20 day or 7 or 30 days. He only has to keep the 1 day. Now that's the brisa. Now the Gemara has a couple of first the Gemara says, what is the halacha? So Gemara says, here you have Rabbi Akiva, who's an individual that's leniently ruling against the Rabbim, against the Chachamim. Generally, the halacha is when an individual gives a lenient ruling, we don't paskin like him, but here we do. That's Rabbi Bar Chanan and Rabbi Yechanan. It says this is an exception, and the reason is because we have the general principle of Shmuel and Hilchas Avelos. We always go leniently in the rules of Avelos and the rules of mourning, and therefore we're going to go leniently here also. Any Shmuel Rechoka is only 1 day of mourning. Okay, now the Gemara says a few incidents. The Gemara says that Rav Chanina had a Shmuel Rechoka. He heard about the death of his father, who was in a place called Veichozoi, and didn't hear about it until after 30 days. He came for Rav Chizna and he said, what should I do? He said, you keep 1 day of mourning. Now, Rabbi Nassan bar Ami, he had a similar incident at the death of his mother, also in Veichozoi. He came and asked Rava, and Rava said, again, you only keep 1 day mourning for Shmuel Rechoka. But now he asked the kasha. He said it's not true. He asked about a brisa that he found that says that only applies to the other 5 relatives, like we've seen, and that's our third opinion. But for a mother and a father, you do have to keep the Shiva and the Shloshim in full. So why, he asked Rava, why are you paskening not like that? Rava said that's one opinion. We don't pasken like that opinion. We pasken like the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara quotes a brisa that spells out that opinion, and the brisa says there was an incident that happened with Rabbi Tzadok in Ginzak, and he found out that his father had died in Ginzak. He wasn't there. He found out 3 years after the death of his father. Came and he asked someone by the name of Elisha ben Avuya. Now, Elisha ben Avuya was a famous apikoros. This was not him. This was someone else, according to Rav Yaakov Emden. And he asked some others that came who were with him, and he asked what is halacha, and they told him you have to keep the full 7 and the full 30. So we see from here that there's the opinion of Elisha ben Avuya, at least, that holds that when one loses a father, he, even though it's a Shmuel Rechoka, he hasn't heard about it for a long time, in this case it was 3 years, he does have to sit Shiva and Shloshim in complete Avelos. So now the Gemara says that Rav Achia, he said Shiva and Shloshim when he heard a Shmuel Rechoka about the loss of his son. The Gemara is a kasha, where we see that Rav Chia does not hold that way. And the Gemara is going to answer and say that this is Rav Achia, that's Rav Chia. It's not the same individual. But let's see the story about Rav Chia. So the Gemara notes that Rav Chia's nephew was Rav. Rav was the son of Rav Chia's brother and sister who were married to each other. That is, Rav Chia's half-brother and half-sister who were unrelated to each other until they got married. They gave birth to Rav, who was Rav Chia's nephew. Now, when Rav Chia met Rav, he said, is your father still alive? Who was Rav Chia's brother. So Rav did not want to say no, so instead he said, why don't you ask about my mother? So he said, okay, is your mother still alive? And he didn't want to say no, so he said, okay, why don't you ask about my father? From that, Rav Chia understood that both his brother and his sister had died, and this was a long time earlier, so it was a Shmuel Rechoka. He told his servant, take off my shoes and take my clothing after me to the bathhouse. So he was taking off his shoes because he was actively participating in mourning, but he was going to the bathhouse because that mourning period was going to end within an hour or so, because Mikzas Hayom Kekulo, he only has to keep Shiva 1 day because it's a Shmuel Rechoka, and he only has to keep Mikzas Hayom part of the day, and therefore he can go take a bath. Normally an Ava would not be allowed to do that. And he did that in order to teach this halacha. So you see, therefore, that he did not hold that you have to keep a full avelos after Shmuel Rechoka under any circumstances, even though here, at least here for the brother and for the sister. So Gemara answers this, as we said, this is not Rav Achia, this is Rav Chia. Now the Gemara says you can learn 3 things out of the story here. You can learn, first of all, that one who is in Ava, one who is in mourning has to take off his shoes. Now that's obvious that we know, but that's visible here as well. You also see that Shmuel Rechoka is only 1 day. You also see Mikzas Hayom Kekulo, that part of the day is enough to serve as the full day. Okay, that concludes that discussion. Now the Gemara goes on to its next halach in the sugya of Shmuel Rechoka, and that is what happens if a person's 30-day period to turn a Shmuel Krova into a Shmuel Rechoka ends on a Yom Tov. Then he finds out on Yom Tov, still within 30 days of the loss of a relative, that his relative has been lost, that he died. So let's say he finds out on the 3rd day of Sukkot that his relative has died 28 days ago. So that's not Shmuel Rechoka yet. However, he can't start keeping Avelos yet because he can't start keeping Avelos until after Yom Tov. Then he finds out by the time Yom Tov is over, it's already more than 30 days. So now, does that count as a Shmuel Rechoka or not? So that's the question that the Gemara asks. Rabbi Yossi bar Avin asks it. And Rabbi Yossi, and he answers that it only counts as you only have to he only has to do Avelis for 1 day because that counts as a Shmua Rechoka. There's a similar statement of Rav Adam and Kisari in front of Rav Yochanan, who said the same thing applies to Shabbos. If he hears about it on Shabbos, which was day 29, and by the time Shabbos is over, it's already 30 full days, counts as a Shmua Rechoka. It doesn't have to keep more than 1 day of Shiva. Okay, now the Gemara asks, it's final halacha. In the discussion of Shmur Choka, someone hears about a Shmur Choka, does he have to tear Kriya or not? Does he have to rip his clothing in the manner that is usually performed by an Ava who hears about the loss of a close relative? So Gemara says, Machokis, Rabbi Mani says he does not tear Kriya, Rabbi Chini says he does. So Rabbi Mani says that the way I hold that you don't tear Kriya is more logical because you never find Kriya without a Shiva. One, the halachas of Kriya and Shiva go together. They're both the significant mourning activities. So you say that he has to tear Kriya, but he doesn't sit Shiva, he only has to sit 1 day. So the Gemara says that he was not impressed by that, and he said, no, you do find a situation in which a person tears Kriya even though he doesn't sit Shiva. And he quotes a discussion of Amram that says that, and where he calls it a Brisa, of Isi Avua, Isi the father of Rabbi Zera, or perhaps the brother of Rabbi Zera, who said to Rabbi Zera, he said over this brisa, he said somebody who only has 1 clothing, he has 1 shirt, and it's not even his, it's a borrowed shirt, so he cannot tear that shirt. And then he hears about the loss of a relative, he cannot tear the shirt because it doesn't belong to him. So what should he do? Nothing. He can't tear Kriya, so he can't. However, if he later gets another shirt in the middle of the Avelis period, in the middle of the Shiva, he can tear it then when he gets his own shirt. Now, what if he gets his own shirt after Avelis is ended? So the Brisa says, according to Rabbi Zera's comment, that you do tear Kriya, that he would tear Kriya at that point, even though he doesn't have any Shiva any longer. Now, Rabbi Zera said that's for the father or the mother, meaning if it would be for any other relative, he wouldn't, but for the father or the mother, he would. Anyway, what we see from here is that it's possible to tear Kriya without any Shiva. Shiva is over, and he's tearing Kriya now. So my answers, not a kasha on Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Chanina will say that's not the halacha of Kriya. That's someone who wants to show honor and respect for his lost father or mother by tearing Kriya, but it's not that he's fulfilling the halacha and the obligation. He just wants to show respect. Okay, now the Gemara gets into a discussion. The Gemara begins discussing who are the mourners for which one has to sit Shiva. So the Gemara quotes a brisa that says anyone that a Kohen is allowed to become Tameh to attend to, any of the relatives that he may be Metameh for, as is listed in the pasuk specifically, those are the 7 close relatives for which he must sit Shiva. And that list is as follows. You have the mother and the father, the brother and the sister, the son and the daughter, and the spouse. That is, whichever it is, a husband or a wife. Those are the 7. Now the Gemara says those are only deraisa, and the Chachamim added a few. Now, when it says a sister deraisa, it only says the single, unmarried sister through the father. So the Chachamim added any sister at all. They added a sister through the mother, and they added a married sister, no matter which side it is. So a sister is also included. Now the Gemara says, what about shneim? What about relatives of one's relatives? Does he have to sit Shiva for them as well? So here the Gemara quotes Machlokes between Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and the Chachamim, Rabbi Kiva says, yes, one must sit Shiva for the relatives of one's relatives. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, no, only for very close relatives, and that is a grandson and a grandfather, the son of a son and the father of a father. None other ones. Now, the Chachamim say he has to mourn together with his close relatives. His relatives aren't mourning, so he also needs to mourn. Now the Gemara says that's exactly the same as Rabbi Kiva's opinion, that he should sit Shiva for his relatives of his relatives. The Gemara says no. What the Chachamim hold is that it's only when they are there. When you're on your own, you don't. When the close relative is mourning in one's presence, then he should sit Shiva together with him as well, and it's a sign of respect for one's close relative to mourn together with him. Now, the Gemara quotes incident where Mar Okva lost his brother-in-law, that is the brother of his wife, and he was going to sit Shiva together with his wife. Rav Huna came to him and he saw what was happening, and he said, what are you sitting Shiva for? You want to be able to eat the special meal that neighbors serve to a mourner, you have no business sitting Shiva here. This is only the brother of your wife. You only sit Shiva for the relative of one's wife, for one's wife's father or mother. There you show respect and honor to one's wife by sitting Shiva together with her. However, just for a brother, you would not. Now he proves this from a contradiction between two brises. One brisa seems to indicate that one sits Shiva for the relative of his wife, and one seems to indicate that one does not sit Shiva for the relative of his wife, and the resolution of the two is that for one's wife's mother and father, he does sit Shiva. For one's wife's brother, he does not sit Shiva. Now, let's see the two brises. The first one says somebody who has lost his father-in-law or his mother-in-law. Obviously, his wife has lost her father and mother, so she has to keep the halachas of mourning. She does not put on makeup, not eye makeup, and not cheek makeup of any sort. She turns the bed over and she sits on a low surface. Now, he should also mourn together with her. He should keep all those halachas together with her. Now, if a woman has lost her father-in-law or mother-in-law, again, the same halachas apply. She should keep the halachas of mourning together with her husband. Don't wear the makeup, sit on a low surface, turn over the bed, and keep mourning halachas. That's the first brisa that shows that one should mourn for his spouse's relatives. Then we have a different brisa that says that a woman who is sitting Shiva for someone, if she's sitting Shiva, it doesn't say for who, she doesn't put on makeup, she sits on a low surface, but she can prepare wine for her husband and help him wash and take care of his needs. Now, what's he doing washing? If he's supposed to be mourning together with his wife, he shouldn't be washing. Obviously, this is a situation where the husband is not mourning together with his wife, and that's the contradiction. And it must be referring to, the Gemara explains, that it's not a father or a mother of the wife, it's just a sibling of the wife, and therefore he's not sitting Shiva together with her. Now, the more quotes a brisa that says it's clearly that a person should mourn he should honor his wife by mourning with her for her parents, but not for another relatives. Now the Gemara has an incident here. The Gemara says that Ameimar had a son, and his son became an aval. His son lost his son. So Ameimar tore kriya, he tore his clothing for his grandson. Then his son came to be with him. Now he had another obligation to tear kriya because now he was with him. Now he had the opinion of the chachamim, which would say that now he's chayav to tear kriya, and therefore he tore kriya again. After he tore a second time, he realized that he had torn kriya in a seated position, and the halacha is one must tear kriya standing. So he stood up, and now he tore kriya a third time. And the Gemara wants to know, how does one know that kriya must be torn in a standing position? That's a lengthy discussion, which we'll address on Daf Chaf Aleph.